Greetings. I'm Chelsea Wood. I'm a professor at the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. And parasites are one of my favorite topics to teach. It is very rare, even among advanced undergraduates in biology, to find folks who have actually learned anything about parasites during their biological education. And this is despite the fact that parasites are literally everywhere, lying just beneath the surface of all the things that you find familiar, your favorite animals, your pets, maybe even you. Why are parasites so rarely addressed in biology education? Well, I'm not sure, but I have some ideas. One is that they're small and usually hidden inside of their hosts. This isopod parasite on the cheek of a grouper is an exception, of course. But when things are small and hidden, they can be easy to ignore. But another reason is that they inspire revulsion. Parasites are things that you find in your poop, that eat you alive from the inside out, that invade you and live inside your body without you ever knowing it. That's creepy, and it's a thing that most people would rather avoid. But it's not something that I avoid. I think parasites are fascinating, the unseen puppeteers that pull the strings of an ecosystem. And I find that once students learn just a little bit about parasites, that enthusiasm is infectious. So, parasites are rarely addressed in biology education, and this is despite the fact that about 40% of animal species on the planet are parasitic. Let that statistic just sink in for a moment. Among the animals, parasites nearly match the diversity of what we call free-living or non-parasitic species. Almost every other animal species is a parasite. Certainly, any group of organisms that numerous must be up to something ecologically important. But not only are the parasites very common in nature, they've also arrived at the solution of parasitism by taking a number of different pathways to the same destination. Because among the animals, parasites have evolved 223 times. What do I mean when I say that there have been 223 independent evolutionary origins of parasitism? That means that there are 223 separate, independent events in which a parasitic species has evolved from a non-parasitic species. There is then the opportunity for more parasitic species to radiate from that origin. Here's what that looks like on a phylogenetic tree. Here we've got a figure from a study by Sarah Weinstein and Armin Kuris, where these parasite ecologists looked across the tree of life for the kingdom Animalia. And they asked, how often do we see a parasitic branch evolve from a non-parasitic branch? The answer they came up with, of course, is 223. In green at the top are all of the metazoa, meaning all of the multicellular animals. The orange tree breaks out one branch of the metazoa, the arthropods, and the purple tree breaks out one branch of the arthropods, the insects. The size of each branch corresponds to the number of independent evolutionary origins of parasites for that particular branch. So you might notice some things about this figure. One is that parasitism has evolved a bunch of times, but more in some groups than in others. The Diptera, or the flies, are particularly rich in independent evolutionary origins of parasitism. You can also take a look through this tree and highlight some of your favorites, especially the clades that you're already familiar with, so you can begin to think about integrating your new understanding of parasites into your established understanding of the free-living species. So while parasites are scattered all across the tree of life, there are four major groups of parasites that we will cover. The flatworms, including the flukes and the tapeworms. The nematodes, a group that includes the roundworms, pinworms, and filarial worms. The arthropods, that branch that we zoomed in on the previous slide, including the crustaceans, insects, and mites. And finally, the protozoa, a branch not shown on the previous slide because unlike the metazoans, the protozoa are just single-celled animals. They've also evolved some pretty impressive parasitic strategies among the amoebae, flagellates, ciliates, and the apicomplexans. 223, everything from jellyfish to insects, copepods to worms, all landing on the same strategy for making a living in the world. There must be something awesome about parasitism if all these different branches of the tree of life are headed there. And that's what we'll talk about today. We'll begin by getting super clear about what we mean when we say parasite, who is a parasite and who is not. We'll talk about the characteristics that these organisms share in common with one another, despite the fact that they're the result of 223 different independent evolutionary events. And we'll answer the question, who cares? We've been ignoring parasites for a long time, including by failing to teach them to our biology undergraduates. Can't we just carry on ignoring them? Let's find out. Let's begin just by considering your impressions. What do you think a parasite is? Most people will come up with definitions like small, blood-sucking. Sometimes we even get a little literary and think about words like cowardly or lazy. And I don't know, depending on your perspective, you can attach all of those definitions to parasites, but let's come up with a formal definition. A parasite is an organism that lives in an intimate and durable relationship with a host where that host suffers a fitness cost. By intimate, we mean spatially close, and by durable, we mean temporally long. These are not one-off interactions. They are long-lasting, they're snuggly. Now let's explore the boundaries of that definition. By this definition, is a human fetus a parasite on its mom? Well, you might think, yeah, the fetus is reducing some aspects of its mom's fitness, right? Like it endangers her life in childbirth. But we know that fitness is measured as the number of offspring. So in the big picture, that fetus is actually increasing its mom's fitness. And so we wouldn't necessarily define a fetus as a parasite. Even though it is, of course, taking energy from its mom host, it is ultimately contributing to her fitness. So fitness is an important concept for us to keep in mind as we move forward. And we need to remember that a parasite, by definition, causes a loss of host fitness. So by this definition, is a mosquito that bites you a parasite? Well, you might think, yeah, a mosquito can certainly reduce its host fitness. It's stealing blood, for one thing. That's an energetic drain. But is this relationship intimate? It's not quite an intimate relationship because it isn't spatially close or temporally long, right? This is a relationship that's just a one-off relationship that's over and done in a matter of seconds. Mosquitoes and other biting insects have a special place in parasite ecology, which we will discuss soon. As we get deeper into parasite ecology, we'll discuss both ectoparasites, which are parasites that live on the outside of the host, and endoparasites, or parasites that live inside the host. And you're often going to hear me refer to disease. Disease is any kind of fitness loss due to parasitism. So it might be death caused by the malaria protozoan, or the disability caused by the polio virus, or something as minor as the gastrointestinal irritation that's caused by being infected with worms. But parasitism is defined by this effect on its host. Now, parasitism exists alongside other symbiotic interactions, other intimate and durable relationships that have other outcomes for the host. For commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism, the symbiont always benefits, but there are different outcomes for the host in each of these kinds of relationship. In commensalism, the symbiont benefits, but there's no effect on the host. It can be a little hard to generate an example of commensalism because in species interactions, it's almost impossible not to influence the fitness of the species you're interacting with. But a textbook example are the cattle egrets, which eat bugs scared up by cattle moving around in a field. They live in a spatially close and temporally durable relationship with that cow host, but the cow is completely unaffected by the presence of the egret, and so we would call that a commensalism. In mutualism, the symbiont benefits, and so does the host. What a kind world. What examples of mutualism do you know? Common ones might be things like coral and their zooxanthellae symbionts, ants and acacia trees, or clownfish and anemones. And in parasitism, the symbiont benefits and the host suffers a fitness cost. What a cruel world. Let's dive deeper into that cruel world and understand the types of parasitism that we might encounter in nature. Parasitism is a consumer strategy, just like predation. Like predators, parasites consume other organisms to make a living. Unlike predators, parasites do not kill their prey. There are a couple different ways to be a parasite. You can be a typical parasite, a parasitoid, a parasitic castrator, or a trophically transmitted parasite. There are also a couple of different ways to be a predator. You can be a typical predator or a micropredator. Let's step through each of these strategies together, but as we step through these strategies, remember that parasites are sneaky. They can actually use different strategies at different points in their life cycles, as we will see. The way to distinguish among these different kinds of predators and parasites is to pay attention to 3 criteria. The first is, how many hosts or prey items are you attacking? The second is, what effect does this have on host fitness? And the third is, must the host or that prey item die in order for you to live? We can make a handy dandy table to help narrow in on what category you fit into, like so. So let's step through it together, starting with this first division at the top between parasites and predators. You'll notice here that we've defined parasites as those consumers that use only one host and predators that use more than one. What does that mean? Well, if you're a parasite, you pick a host and that is it. You guys are in an intimate and durable relationship. You're in it for the long haul. Consider, on the other hand, a predator. A white shark doesn't just eat one prey item and then call it a day. It needs to eat hundreds and maybe thousands of organisms in its lifetime in order to live. And that's what separates parasites from predators. Now, sharks are not the only predators around. Remember how we said earlier that mosquitoes aren't parasites because they don't exist in a durable relationship with their hosts? We define mosquitoes and lots of other biting things as micropredators because they are feeding on many, many hosts. A great aquatic example are the leeches, some of which are specialized to feed on fish. Here's one feeding on the blind side of a flatfish. These leeches move from one fish to another, taking a small blood meal from one and moving on to the next, just like a mosquito. And because their relationships with hosts are not temporally durable, and because they feed on many hosts, we call them micropredators. Contrast that with the typical parasites, which just stick around forever, feeding on just one host. And here we have our first division between the parasites and the predators, and between predators and micropredators. So we've discussed our first criterion, how many hosts you feed on. Let's now talk about the next two, your effect on host fitness and whether you require host death in order to successfully complete your life cycle. There are two ways to affect your host's fitness if you're a parasite or a predator. We already know that both of these consumer strategies are, by definition, bad for the host or the prey item, but how bad are they? They can either be very terrible, where your fitness is reduced absolutely to zero, or they can be bad but not the worst, where your fitness is reduced but not all the way to zero. By the same token, we often think about parasites as needing their hosts to live, keeping the host alive so that they can continue to be fed on for the long term. Because for many parasites, if the host dies, the parasite dies too. But there are some parasite strategies where host death is actually beneficial to the parasite. Let's see some examples of each of these four categories. You know, one thing that you realize when you're studying parasitism is that there is nothing new under the sun. Every horror movie you've ever seen is inspired by something in nature, and nature does it better than Hollywood. Take the insect parasitoids. In this case, I'm showing you a braconid wasp. This wasp is a parasitoid because it has this crazy strategy for provisioning its larvae with food. It finds some big, juicy, unsuspecting, undefended caterpillar. It then takes its ovipositor, pierces the body wall of the caterpillar, and lays its eggs inside the caterpillar's body cavity. The caterpillar is alive through this entire process. And then the wasp leaves, and maybe the caterpillar is relieved. It's escaped with its life. But over the coming weeks, it feels weird, lethargic, uncoordinated, something's wrong. Inside the caterpillar's body, those eggs are developing. They hatch and they need food. And those larvae consume the caterpillar from the inside out until it is a mere husk, and the larvae emerge to go on to their next life stage. Now, Hollywood has immortalized this grotesque approach to making a living. For years, I've used the movie Alien as an example, even though it was made before most of you were born. In this movie, a bunch of folks are living on a spacecraft, and one day they're attacked by this horrible alien which attaches itself to a dude. He escapes, he thinks he's safe, but all the while that alien larva is developing inside of him, consuming him from the inside out until he is a mere husk and the larva emerges to go on to its next life stage. But I need not use a movie made in the 1970s as an example anymore, because Netflix has adopted the parasitoid storyline. What Netflix series am I talking about? No spoilers, but there is a pretty scary parasitoid in Stranger Things. Now, I can talk about parasitoids in popular culture without seeming like I'm a dinosaur. But it isn't just the flies, the dipterans, that can do the parasitoid thing. There are plenty of marine examples as well, like this worm in the genus Phaecampia, which infects marine shrimps. It develops in their body cavity, and when it's done developing, it bursts out into the world, killing its host. There's more than one way to reduce your host fitness to zero. How can you reduce host fitness to zero without killing your host? Well, the parasitic castrators have figured out how to do this. Fitness is all about reproduction. If you kill your host can't reproduce. And if you castrate your host can't reproduce, but it doesn't need to die. Let me introduce you to a very charismatic parasitic castrator. This trematode worm infects the California horn snail, Cerathidia californica. If you crack open a snail's shell and pull its body out, this is what you'll see. The spiral part of the body is called the visceral mass, and it includes a bunch of digestive tissue as well as the gonads of the snail. When the snail is infected with trematodes, this is what the visceral mass looks like. Those white sausage-shaped things are the parasite's reproductive structures. The parasite has consumed, literally eaten, all of the host gonad and used it to clone itself millions of times. By eating the gonad, trematodes block snail reproduction, and those parasitically castrated hosts become the living dead. They're still alive, they're still trucking around, they're still eating, but they will never again produce a snail baby. All that they will do for the rest of their hijacked lives is produce baby parasites. So that is how some parasites can reduce their host's fitness to absolute zero, while others leave the host at least a little bit of fitness to get along with. These parasitic castrators and parasitoids reduce their host fitness to zero either by killing or castrating their hosts. That is what leads us to place the parasitic castrators and the parasitoids in this table. But there's one cell in the table that we haven't yet talked about, the trophically transmitted parasites, which allow hosts a little bit of fitness, but ultimately do require the host to die. What does that strategy look like? Well, I briefly mentioned the trematodes as parasitic castrators of snails, but at other points in their life cycles, they engage in trophic transmission. Remember that parasites can switch their consumer strategies over the course of their life cycles. This is illustrated beautifully by the trematodes. If you're a trematode, you are born inside the intestine of a large predatory bird, like this egret. You're pooped out into the environment where, if you're lucky, you land in a nice, soft, warm pile of mud in the intertidal zone. There you hatch out of your egg casing and swim out as a miracidium, a tiny ciliated larval stage whose sole purpose in life is to find a snail intermediate host. You're in luck. You found a nice, juicy horn snail to infect. Once you've penetrated the body wall of that snail, you find your way to that visceral hump where you begin asexually replicating yourself millions of times over. When they're fully cooked, these clones, which we call cercaria, emerge from the snail into the water column where they swim around looking for a second intermediate host to infect. Once you find yourself a nice mussel or crab or fish, that cercaria forms a cyst called a metacercaria, and it lays in wait. It's waiting for that second intermediate host to be eaten by the final or definitive host. And once in the intestinal tract of that bird, the worm can hatch, grow up into an adult, find another adult trematode to settle down with, have some eggs, and the cycle begins anew. So just within this life cycle, we see 3 different kinds of parasitism. The trematode is a typical parasite in its bird definitive host. It's a parasitic castrator in its snail first intermediate host. And it's a trophic transmitter in its second intermediate host. That is, it lets its host have some fitness. This infected fish is still going to go about its fish business. It can still have some fish babies. But ultimately, it needs to die in order for its parasite to be transmitted. And it needs to die in a very specific way, in the beak of an egret. So both the typical parasite and the trophically transmitted parasite let their hosts have some fitness, but ultimately the trophically transmitted parasite needs its host to die in order that it may live. So let's boil all of this down into plain language. A parasitoid kills its host. A parasitic castrator destroys its host gonads. Trophically transmitted parasites lay in wait for their prey host to be eaten by a predator host. Typical parasites need their host to continue living. Predators eat many prey individuals, and micropredators eat a little bit of many prey individuals. Okay, So we've now seen lots of diversity among the parasites. They are scattered all across the tree of life. The strategy of parasitism has evolved 223 times. There are these 4 or 5 categories of parasite life history. But are there other traits that cut across these parasite categories? What are the traits that most parasites have in common with one another? First, most parasites are crazy efficient when it comes to converting the food they eat into their own biomass. When we think about the food conversion efficiency of animals, we usually measure that as the proportion of ingested energy that goes to production. For most vertebrates, this is vanishingly low. For example, imagine I could wave a magic wand and suddenly increase your food conversion efficiency. The average American eats 3 to 4 pounds of food per day. Now imagine that for every pound of food that you ate, you gained a third of a pound. So you put on about a pound a day. You would be obese in a matter of days. Instead, it's more typical for vertebrates to have food conversion efficiencies on the order of just a few percent. So in the example that I'm going to show you, which comes from lab rats and their tapeworm hosts, or sorry, their tapeworm parasites, Hymenolipus diminuta, in this example, the rat eats some amount of food. 20% of that is never even absorbed. It's just pooped right out. It's indigestible. Of what is absorbed, only 5% of it goes to produce rat tissue, either rat biomass or the biomass of its offspring, and 95% just goes to keeping the lights on, metabolic maintenance and repair. Compare that to the tapeworm living inside of the rat. It will absorb less than 1% of what the rat ingests. Of that material, 37% makes more tapeworm biomass, the equivalent of you putting on a pound per day. Now, while becoming obese decreases human fitness, it increases tapeworm fitness. The bigger you are, the more tapeworm eggs you can produce, and the higher your fitness. The same is true for a rat. The bigger you are, the more babies you have. So why doesn't the rat just increase its food conversion efficiency? Well, the rat needs to invest a lot more energy in finding and getting food. It needs structures for moving around the world, like legs. It needs structures for locating food, like a nose, for ingesting food, like a mouth, for avoiding predation, like behaviors that let it run away from cats. The tapeworm, all it does is just lay around and get bathed in perfect food. It doesn't even have eyes. Because it doesn't need to invest in all of that infrastructure, its energy requirements are really low, meaning that most ingested energy doesn't need to go to maintenance in the tapeworm the way that it does to the rat. Now, one of the benefits of having really high food conversion efficiency is that you can allocate a large proportion of your resources to reproduction, and parasites are extremely good at this. One way that we can see this is by comparing parasites to their most closely related free-living cousins. Consider the barnacles. You're all familiar with what free-living barnacles look like. They live their lives contained inside these tiny tests or shells. Their gonads are also contained inside of those shells. Now let's compare those free-living barnacles to the parasitic rhizocephalin barnacles. These are indeed barnacles, but rather than settling on rocks and building tests, they settle on the carapaces of decapods like this poor crab. They drill through the carapace and enter the body cavity of the crab, and there they spread almost like a fungus. They don't look like barnacles at all. They look like rootlets spreading through the entire body of the crab. And when they've fully invaded and siphoned off enough of the crab's energy, they create this structure that you can see on the belly of the crab underneath its telson. That structure is called an externa. It's the parasite's gonad, enormous compared to its free-living barnacle cousins, and far more fecund. But that's not the weirdest part. This barnacle then manipulates the crab to care for the externa in the way that the crab would care for its own crab eggs. And it even does this in male crabs. The crab will carefully aerate the externa, and when the parasite babies are ready to be born, it will climb up to a high point, lower its telson, and create water movement to disperse the parasite babies with its claws. So not only does this parasite have an enormous gonad, it also enlists the crab's help in allowing the parasite babies to survive and disperse. Wild. So parasites are pumping out babies at an alarming rate, but they also grow at rates that are alarming. Take the example of the human roundworm, Ascaris lumbricoides. People get this parasite by eating these teeny tiny eggs which contaminate unwashed vegetables, especially vegetables that are fertilized with human feces. Once that egg hits your intestine, it hatches and grows explosively. In the course of 60 days, that egg becomes this 30-centimeter roundworm, which can live happily in the human intestine for years at a time. Here's a live one in a human small intestine imaged by colonoscopy. We often think of parasites as small because they are small relative to their hosts, but they are really big when you compare them to their free-living cousins. Consider the free-living copepods. This is a histogram with mean body length on the x-axis and number of copepod species on the y. You can see that most free-living copepods are very small. Compare that to the parasitic copepods, which can reach lengths of 35 millimeters or 3.5 centimeters. Similarly, we often think about parasites as short-lived because we're used to comparing them with their hosts. Most people will outlive the parasites living inside them. But when we compare parasitic species to their closely related free-living cousins, we see that they have very long lifespans. On the x-axis here is longevity in years, and on the y, number of species. Most free-living nematodes live less than a year. Meanwhile, parasitic nematodes can live over 20 years. Okay, so parasites convert energy like nobody's business. They're incredibly fecund, and they're big and long-lived. And this begs the question, are parasites Darwinian demons? The concept of the Darwinian demon was developed by Law in 1979, and it's a thought experiment where we imagine what the perfect organism would look like. And when I say perfect organism, I mean the fittest organism of them all, the one that overcomes all evolutionary and ecological constraints, maximizing all aspects of its fitness with no need for trade-offs. And in particular, the Darwinian demon maximizes its reproductive output, grows rapidly, and lives a long time. Sounds familiar, right? The lifestyle of parasitism lifts a key constraint on life, which is food. Parasites are bathed in perfect food. All they need to do is lay around and soak it up. However, it is not a perfect world for parasites because they have some unique constraints that free-living species don't need to worry about. Think for a second, what is it about parasitism that's more difficult than being a free-living species? It's easy to think about the things that are easier. What are the things that are more difficult? One is that parasites not only need to find a suitable habitat, they also need to find a suitable host within that habitat. So once they get to their destination, life is good, but finding that destination is especially challenging for parasites relative to their hosts. And all species can occasionally experience hostile environmental conditions, right? Extreme heat, extreme cold, storms. But the environment that a parasite lives on is literally bent on its destruction. The host wants to get rid of the parasite, and its entire body is built to defend against parasitic infection and to kill parasites if they do make it inside. Think about the immune system. It's meant to destroy parasites. So while they do have it good in some ways, parasites are dealing with a perpetually hostile environment, which is not something that free-living species have to contend with. While parasites do fit some of the parameters of the Darwinian demon, they have special challenges as well, including finding their habitat and surviving once they're there. Okay, so we've learned a bunch of stuff about parasites, and now I want to answer the question, who cares? They're small, they're mostly invisible. We've gotten along just fine ignoring them until now. Can't we go on ignoring them? Well, that question might sound silly, but it's one that's been asked by some pretty prominent people. In the 1960s and 70s, there dawned this general feeling that infectious disease had been conquered. There's a great quote by Robert Petersdorf, who himself was an infectious disease specialist. He was a one-time president of the Association of American Medical Colleges and one of the youngest ever chairmen of medicine in the United States. And in 1978, he wrote an article about specialization in medicine, specialties. He noted, "Even with my great personal loyalties to infectious disease, I cannot conceive of a need for 309 more infectious disease experts." Now, if we think back to that time in history, it was just in the wake of the total global eradication of smallpox. Here, I'm going to spare you a picture of a smallpox patient, but suffice it to say, smallpox was a horrible disease, painful, disfiguring, deadly, and very, very infectious. It It besieged humanity for centuries. And then in the late 1970s, it was wiped off the face of the earth by doctors working together all around the world. Now, think about the size of that triumph. That was such a tremendous accomplishment, and it surely spared millions of people from suffering and death. And so at the time, it looked like medical science had won the war against infectious disease. But it doesn't look that way today. Today, there's always news of a scary new infectious disease. Lyme disease, SARS, bird flu, swine flu, Middle East respiratory syndrome, Ebola, and of course, COVID-19. And COVID-19 is far from unique. It's exploded in a sudden massive outbreak, but human diseases are present all the time, quietly eating away at people's health. I'll list just a handful. River blindness is caused by a worm called Onchocerca volvulus. The worm lives in the gut of black flies and it infects people in the black fly bite, causing slowly over time blindness. Guinea worm lives in freshwater crustaceans called copepods that are accidentally swallowed with contaminated water, and it creates these deeply painful lesions. Hookworm, ascaris, and whipworm have larval stages that live in the environment, waiting for the opportunity to penetrate a person's skin or invade their intestinal tract through contaminated water or food. And these three alone are called the geohelminths because they're transmitted in soil, and they infect 1.5 billion people. Think about that. 7 billion people live on Earth. 1.5 billion of them have a geohelminth infection. And they're far from alone. Here's a list of parasites infecting people and the number of people that they infect in millions. Our geohelminths are at the top, but there are plenty more. Most of these parasites affect people in the developing world, but the developed world does not escape the reach of these infectious diseases. Depending on how many people are watching this video right now, there's likely to be 100% probability that the parasite is in the room with us right now. If not in one of you, then very likely in me. There's an overall 20% infection rate for North Americans. This is a single-celled parasite related to malaria. Its name is Toxoplasma gondii. We sometimes call it toxo for short. And you're at much higher risk of toxo if you like your meat rare, which I do, and if you've ever lived at some point in your life with an outdoor cat, which I have. So let's see how this works. Toxo, of course, is a globally distributed disease. It's at about a 20% prevalence in North America. The prevalence is about 30% worldwide. And it's a funny thing to think about because most people don't even know that they're infected. Now, the parasite reproduces in the intestinal tract of a cat. Its eggs are passed into the feces of cats, and that feces can go on to contaminate vegetation that then is eaten by grazing animals. The parasite then insists in the muscle of those grazing animals, and when those animals are butchered and eaten, those cysts can be transmitted to another host. That includes people, and so one means of transmission that's common for people is through consuming undercooked or raw meat. You can also get toxoplasma from eating vegetables that have been contaminated with cat feces. Now, toxo is a real danger for pregnant women. Women who get infected with toxo during their pregnancies can wind up having fetuses with developmental abnormalities. And this parasite is totally fascinating because not only does it affect a huge percentage of the global human population, it also manipulates human behavior. So those people who are infected are about 3 times as likely to get into a car accident. And there might be other neurological effects of being infected by toxo. So all that is to say that while 1.5 billion people are infected with geohelminths, and those people are primarily concentrated in the developing world, we here in the developed world are not immune. We have our own infectious diseases, often transmitted from animals to people. Now, not only are parasites really important for human health, they're also important ecologically because they're ubiquitous. I mentioned earlier, almost every other animal species on Earth is parasitic. I've traveled a bunch as a professional ecologist, and in my travels, I'm always on the lookout for parasites. I want to show you some of the parasites that I've encountered incidentally in the course of my travels. These three are ones that I found mostly in pelagic fishes caught during a sailing trip that I took across the central equatorial Pacific. Now, this hideous and terrifying worm I cut out of the stomach of a pelagic fish called a wahoo. This is Hirudinella marina. It's a giant trematode. And these guys live in pairs in the stomachs of wahoo, and there they reproduce and produce eggs that are dispersed in the feces of that pelagic fish. These parasites that you're about to see came from some snails that I cracked open on a tropical atoll called Palmyra. Now, these are the larval stages of a different trematode species. So not Hirudinella marina, different trematode species, and this is the larval stage. And then finally, we come to my very favorite, a trypanorhynch tapeworm larva. Now, this is the larval stage of a tapeworm, so it doesn't look like that classic tape that you're used to seeing. That's what the adults look like. This larval stage was inside of a pelagic tuna, and it's basically laying in wait. It's a trophically transmitted parasite, and it's waiting for that tuna to be consumed by a predator, specifically by a shark. Once it gets into the intestine of that shark, it's going to take those 4 little tentacles that you can see it everting off of its anterior end. Each of those tentacles is armed with a bunch of backward-facing hooks. And it will take those tentacles and lay them down on the intestinal wall of the shark that is unlucky enough to consume that tapeworm baby. And then it will use those hooks to hold onto the intestinal wall of the shark. An ingenious adaptation. These parasites were not at all hard to find. They are in every animal that you see around you, and they're likely in some of the humans that you see around you as well. In fact, parasitism is so popular that the science writer Carl Zimmer once wrote of it, "Forget lions, tigers, and sharks. The billions of tiny parasites that make a living castrating and brainwashing their hosts may be the new kings of the food web." Let me show you what he means by that by way of example. This is the California killifish, the snack food of the salt marshes along the west coast of North America. The California killifish is infected by a trematode called Euhaplorchus californiensis. This trematode forms cysts called metacercaria that infect the brain of the killifish. And the more cysts there are on the brain of the killifish, the more conspicuous behaviors these fish exhibit. What do I mean by conspicuous behaviors? Well, these killifish typically spend their time hiding. They're preyed on by birds, and so they like to hang out near the bottom, hiding from those visual predators. Unless they have cysts on their brains, those cysts are associated with behaviors that are really unusual for these fish. In fact, infected fish are way more likely to be eaten by birds, and the more infected they are, the likelier they are to be eaten. This has an interesting effect. It means that in the presence of the parasite, there are way more fish available for these birds to eat because the fish aren't hiding anymore. They're just out there waiting for a bird to come along and snap them up. And this should have the effect of allowing more birds to exist in the ecosystem. If we could wave a magic wand and eliminate all of the parasites, the fish would be much smarter and the birds would be way fewer. This is the story of just one parasite, but what happens in the killifish isn't strange in nature, and in fact, it's probably quite common. So what is a parasite? It's an organism that lives in an intimate and durable relationship with a host where that host suffers a fitness cost. There are lots of characters that unite this diverse group, including fast growth, high reproduction, longevity, and other adaptations to and constraints on the life parasitic. And who cares? Hopefully, you. Thanks for listening.